Last week, as I was checking social media and as I was checking the news, I was awestruck at the amount of fear and anger that I saw as the result of the election. The great majority of my fellow millennials and Americans were not too ecstatic about the results and often took to the streets, protesting on college campuses, demonstrating with signs saying, "Not my president," and ultimately predicting how bad the situation is going to be in the coming years. Now, as I say these things, the message of this homily is not to talk about the election. We're past that. I'm not rejoicing in the election results, and I'm not bemoaning them either. And I don't want to criticize those who might be angry still about the results, because everyone has the right to be angry. But I want to point out something very concerning about what we saw in our nation as a result of the election. We lost our peace as a people. We allowed this event to cause us a great internal anguish. And ultimately, for many of us, we allowed fear and anger to take hold and to rule over us, to govern us, if you will. Now, with this notion of governing and ruling in mind, today we celebrate two important events in the life of the church. The first today is the Feast of Christ the King, the last Sunday at the end of the liturgical year. We start a new year next Sunday at the beginning of Advent. Also, today marks the end of the Year of Mercy, which Pope Francis inaugurated last December. Now, what is the image that we get when we think of a king? We're in the American context, so we tend not to have a very high image of a king. Our nation started because of a rebellion against a king. It's in our cultural DNA to not think very highly of kingly authority, or royal authority for that matter. A king is seen as a hard-handed ruler, somewhat oppressive at times. But there are a couple of important aspects about a king that we need to consider. First of all, a king's job is to govern, to rule over people, and to protect their welfare. Secondly, a king is invested with divine authority. Hundreds of years ago, kings used to be consecrated, much like a bishop would. They would have oil, the sacred chrism, poured over their head to show a sign of their own divine authority coming from God. Now today, as we look at the Feast of Christ the King, we have two images of Jesus as a king. The first one was in the gospel we just read, and the other one is right over there in the corner of the sanctuary. We have an image of Christ the King. Now, if you look at that image, you see that Jesus has a crown of gold on his head. He has royal robes. He, just by his appearance, looks as if he has a lot of authority, a very commanding presence. And you can see the divine authority emanating from him. Now contrast that with the image of the King Jesus we just heard in the gospel. He's not wearing a crown of gold. He's wearing a crown of thorns. He's not wearing royal robes. Instead, he's naked on the cross. And it doesn't seem that he has a lot of royal authority or divine authority because he's vulnerable hanging on the cross. But look again. Here's the key when we see what the criminal says to Jesus and Jesus' response. Jesus, remember me when you come into your kingdom. Behold, you will be with me in paradise. That's Jesus' divine authority coming out in terms of mercy. He is ruling with the divine authority of his own mercy, that divine mercy that he's giving to this criminal who's hanging right next to him on the cross. And that's the same type of authority that Jesus wants to use to rule over us. Not with an oppressive, kingly authority that we tend to be against or resistant to, but with the authority of mercy. That mercy that we've reflected on for the last year as we celebrated this year of mercy. Jesus wants to rule over us with this mercy. But oftentimes, we don't let him do that. So oftentimes, we let other things rule over us. We let fear. We let anger. We let unhealthy relationships. We let election results rule over us and cause us great internal anguish. But it's Jesus who wants to rule over us with his mercy. Now, because of our baptism, we share in this divine authority of Christ. We share in this kingly responsibility. In a sense, we all are kings in our own right. And we have received this divine authority from God. Now, none of us runs a nation or a state or probably even a city. Very few of us probably have any civil or political authority. But authority in the divine sense does not imply political authority. How do we govern our own lives? That's the question we can ask. How do we govern ourselves, and how do we govern those who are entrusted to us? How do we use our divine authority to govern our families, our children? How do we govern our jobs, our workplace? How do we govern our employees that are under our care? For us students, how do we govern our studies? How do we govern our free time? For us Americans, how do we govern our own actions in the civil world? And as Catholic Christians, how do we govern our own lives? Do we govern with fear and with anger and with heavy-handedness over other people? Or do we govern with mercy, as Christ did with the criminal on the cross next to him? Maybe the answer is to simply allow ourselves to be governed by the mercy of Jesus Christ the King.